It began with a sound, faint, metallic, deliberate, a shovel biting into the frozen earth beneath a bruised Manchester sky, winter of 1964. At first, the workmen thought it was just another foundation job, another factory being torn down to make room for new council flats. The air was thick with soot and steam, and the city, still clawing its way out of the war, was learning to forget itself. Then the shovel struck something that didn't sound like stone. It rang, hollow, fragile, like the echo of a secret finally surfacing. By the time the foreman knelt to clear the soil, the men had gone silent. What they uncovered was not brick or pipe, but bone, the curve of a skull, pale against the black earth. And beside it, a small, corroded locket with initials no one recognized. That discovery stopped Manchester cold, because the site wasn't a graveyard. It was a ballroom, and buried beneath, it was a story the city had tried, for half a century, to forget. Because what happened next would prove that some buildings don't just hold history. They refuse to let it go. They uncover the first bone just after noon, as a pale, anemic sun breaks through the cloud cover. A foreman named Harold Harry Clegg, a man with hands like weathered stone and a pragmatic disdain for sentiment, notices something pale and long jutting from the compacted soil beneath a crumbling support beam. He thinks at first it's a bit of pipe, lead, maybe, or porcelain for some old plumbing. But as the weak light shifts and the brick dust settles, his brain assembles the shape into an undeniable truth, the gentle, sinister curve of a human femur. Work stops. Cigarettes are dropped and crushed under heavy boots. The men stand in a silent, awkward circle, the way people do when the past suddenly, violently, rises to meet the present. The police are called. By mid-afternoon, the street is cordoned with white tape, and the mill, which had been slated for oblivion, is reborn as a crime scene. They find more bones as the hours drag on, the excavation becoming a grim archaeology. First, a hand, its delicate phalanges curled tight against the ribs as though the person had died, clenching against some unspeakable pain. Then, another skeleton, smaller, lying parallel to the first, as if in a shared, shallow bed. By dusk, 3 complete sets of remains have been unearthed from the dark, moist earth. 2 adult women and 1 man, all buried hastily, carelessly, as if the ground itself had been unwilling to keep them. The news spreads fast, a ripple of unease across the terraced houses and into the warm, beery haze of the pubs, carried on whispers and pints of bitter. Manchester, a city that has seen its fair share of death, from cholera to the Blitz, suddenly finds itself haunted anew by a ghost it never knew it had. What's buried beneath a city tells you what it's tried to forget. And in the 1960s, an era obsessed with progress, with sweeping away the soot-stained Victorian past, forgetting was a kind of civic duty. Yet here, in the soft, black soil of Whitworth Street, history had refused to stay buried. It had waited, patient and skeletal, for the future to dig it up. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. When you hear that 3 bodies were found beneath an old mill, no names, no records, no witnesses, what's the first theory that comes to mind? A brutal crime of passion, sealed by brick and time? A grim wartime secret, too ugly for the history books? A simple, sad cover-up by a powerful employer? Drop 1 word below, just one, the first thing your gut tells you. Because by the end of this story, that instinct might come back to haunt you. The investigation is assigned to Detective Inspector Leonard Havers, a pragmatic man in his mid-40s, whose face seems to have been shaped by a lifetime of frowning at inconvenient truths. He is known for his methodical, almost plodding mind and his profound aversion to speculation. Havers is a relic of an older kind of policing, one shaped by ration books and post-war austerity. He doesn't believe in ghosts, only in evidence, in chain of custody, in the cold, hard facts that build an unassailable case. But what he finds beneath that mill will shake even his measured faith in reason, introducing him to a darkness that bureaucracy alone cannot explain. The bones, when carefully transported to the pathology lab, are confirmed to be decades old. The coroner, a man named Dr. Evans who speaks in dry, technical terms, places them in the late 1930s, perhaps the early 1940s. The war years. That detail alone stirs the imagination. A time when people disappeared easily, when rationing, blackouts, and the nightly terror of the Blitz provided perfect cover for crimes that could vanish into rubble and official silence. Forensics is primitive by modern standards, but enough remains to suggest a horrifying truth. All three individuals died violently. Fractures to the skulls, subtle but definitive, indicate blunt force trauma. Microscopic fibers, analyzed as hemp, suggest traces of rope had once bound their wrists and ankles. And something else, a strange, granular residue on the bones that the coroner can't quite place. He describes it in his report as a fine, crystalline deposit, possibly salt, possibly of an unknown chemical origin. Havers notes it in his own ledger, underlining it once. At the time, it is a curiosity, an anomaly. Later, it will become the key to everything. The mill records hauled from a damp basement archive are incomplete. Boxes of faded invoices, shipping manifests, and payroll ledgers half-eaten by damp and time. But one name keeps surfacing through the decay. Whitworth Dye and Sons, textile dyers and finishers. The mill had operated there from 1891 until its abrupt, unceremonious closure in 1942, just after the worst of the Manchester Blitz. The official record, a single paragraph in a city council minute, says it shut down due to structural damage and critical personnel shortages. But the damage, when Havers cross-references the archive city inspection reports, was noted as superficial. And as for personnel, well, that's where the first real clue lies, hidden in a column of faded ink. A payroll ledger dated March 1942 lists 32 employees. By the June ledger, there are only 29. 3 names simply vanish from the rolls. Eleanor Briggs, age 29, a loom operator. Nora Fielding, age 24, a seamstress. And Samuel Day, age 33, a dye mixer. No termination is noted, no forwarding address, no war service record. They are there 1 month, their names neatly inscribed, and gone the next, erased from the ledger as if they had never existed. And when Havers compares their employee numbers to the small, corroded brass tags found nestled amongst the rib cages of the skeletons, the match is perfect. The bones have names. They belong to Eleanor, Nora, and Samuel. 3 textile workers, buried beneath the very floor they once walked on. The most chilling detail of all, no missing persons reports were ever filed. Not by family, not by neighbors, not by the company itself. It is as though they were erased, not just from life, but from the memory of the city itself. They were officially never gone because they were never missed. The deeper Havers digs, the stranger and more resistant the case becomes. Interviews with surviving mill workers, now elderly, their memories frayed like old cloth, produce a tapestry of conflicting stories. Some remember the missing trio fondly. Eleanor was known for her sharp wit, Nora for her lovely singing voice. Others claim, with a strange vehemence, never to have heard of them. One man, a former foreman named Albert Yates, now living in a tidy, semi-detached house in Altrincham, describes Eleanor Briggs as a good girl, hard worker, but nosy, always poking her nose in what didn't concern her. Another, a former dyer's assistant, remembers Samuel Day as quiet, a thinker, but he kept odd hours. You'd see him heading back to the mill long after his shift was over. Nora Fielding, by all accounts, was bright and fiercely sociable. The kind of young woman who still went dancing at the Ritz on Saturday nights, determined to find joy despite the war and the blackout. Then comes the first real anomaly, the thread that begins to unravel the entire tapestry. When the police, acting on a decades-old address, search the boarding house on Renshaw Street listed for Samuel Day, they find his old sea trunk in a dusty attic, left behind and seemingly forgotten. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed bedsheet that smells of mothballs and decay, is a small, leather-bound journal. The writing is dense, technical, filled with notations about dye compounds, chemical ratios, and temperatures. But near the end, the entries shift in tone. The handwriting becomes more agitated. They've changed the formula again. One entry reads, "Something in the new mix burns my hands and leaves a film on the vats. Briggs says it smells like vinegar and death in the mixing room. The vats bubble at night when no one's near, a low, slow simmer. Fielding thinks we're being watched. I think she's right." The entry is dated March 29th, 1942, 1 week before all three vanish from the face of the earth. The forensic chemist, a brilliant but perpetually harried man brought in from the University of Manchester, analyzes the strange residue samples from the recovered bones. He cross-references them with known textile dyes from the period. One compound stands out, a substance not listed in any commercial dye catalog. An experimental fixative, a mercury-based compound, used in a short-lived, highly classified wartime program designed to produce fabric resistant to chemical agents. The project, he discovers from a footnote in an old industrial chemistry journal, was codenamed Citrine. It had been overseen by a shadowy government subcommittee working with a handful of private mills. Its records, the journal noted, were later sealed under the Official Secrets Act. The implications are staggering. These three workers weren't random victims of a factory manager's rage. They may have been casualties of a covert wartime experiment that had gone horribly, fatally wrong. The kind of quiet tragedy a government at war would have buried, both literally and figuratively, to protect morale and its own reputation. Havers, his detective's instincts now fully alight, tries to obtain the Citrine files through official channels. The request travels up the chain of command and disappears into a void. The reply, when it comes, is a single sheet of paper typed and unsigned. It reads, with brutal finality, "No records found. Cease inquiry." But Leonard Havers does not cease. He's a man who has seen too much bureaucracy used to hide rot. So he does what all good detectives do when the system closes ranks. He looks sideways. A discreet, carefully worded inquiry to a contact in the Home Office yields a single, valuable clue. An address in Stockport where a former Ministry of Supply liaison, one Henry Pollard, now lives in quiet, fearful retirement. Pollard is a frail, yellowed man who seems to be crumbling like the pages of an old book. His hands possess a constant, faint tremor. When Havers visits his small, overheated bungalow, he is initially reluctant to speak, his eyes darting towards the window as if expecting watchers. But a single photograph from Havers' case file changes that. It's the stark crime scene image. 3 skeletons laid out on tarpaulin, the cracked foundation of Whitworth Mill looming in the background. Pollard stares at it for a long, terrible minute, his breath rattling in his chest. Finally, he whispers, I told them it wouldn't stay buried forever." He tells Havers what he can, his voice barely rising above the tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. In 1942, the government, in a state of near panic over the threat of chemical warfare, had contracted certain mills for experimental production. They used volatile, poorly understood compounds intended to make fabrics less flammable, less permeable to gas. The results, Pollard admits, were catastrophic. Workers fell ill with strange, blistering rashes and debilitating neurological symptoms. Some simply collapsed on the factory floor, their bodies seizing. It wasn't poison in the usual sense, Pollard mutters, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief. It was something that clung, like a smoke you couldn't wash off. It got into their clothes, their lungs, their bones. The Project Citrine was shut down quietly, its failure buried. A few deaths, he admits with a look of profound shame, were handled internally. Havers presses him for details, but the old man's eyes glaze over with fear. They were buried, he says finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. In every sense of the word, back in Manchester, the story should end there, a tragic if cynical, wartime atrocity covered by dust and official secrecy. Case closed, but something in the details doesn't sit right with Havers' meticulous mind. If this was just an industrial accident, why were the bodies bound? Why the skull fractures, the clear evidence of violence. And why? Most puzzling of all, does the strange residue on their bones glow with a faint, sickly green phosphorescence under ultraviolet light? The pathologist, in a rare moment of unscientific unease, calls it a phenomenon of unknown and unsettling origin. Then, 2 weeks later, another discovery tilts the world on its axis. During a secondary, more meticulous excavation of the site, a young constable with sharp eyes recovers a rusted metal tin, the kind used for holding breath mints, wedged deep behind a foundation pillar, as if hidden in a hurry. Inside, protected by a layer of wax paper, are several strips of brittle, water-damaged 16mm film. When carefully restored by a specialist, the footage runs for barely 3 minutes. It shows the interior of the mill lit by the harsh, flat light of industrial bulbs. Men in white coats move between large, steaming steel vats. Workers, their faces grim and focused, operate machinery with practiced efficiency. At first glance, it appears to be routine industrial documentation. But then, in the final, shuddering seconds of the film, the camera pans shakily to one of the larger vats. And there, partially obscured by a plume of chemical steam, is a shape, a human form, motionless, submerged. The film cuts abruptly to black. The film reels, now critical evidence, are sent to the Home Office for enhanced analysis. 2 days later, they vanish from the evidence log. No receipt, no record, no return. When a furious Havers demands answers, he is told, with cold, bureaucratic curtness, that the material was reclassified and removed to a secure facility. It is around this time that the periphery of Havers' own life begins to fray. He receives late-night phone calls where only a low, electronic static breathes back at him. A man in an anachronistic bowler hat is seen lingering near his parked Morris Minor on multiple occasions. His home filing cabinet, he discovers one evening, has been subtly disturbed. The files are in a slightly different order, though nothing appears to be missing. Havers, never one for paranoia, begins to feel a cold finger tracing its way down his spine. He starts keeping his most sensitive notes not in his office, but locked in his desk at the station. If they mean to scare me, he tells his only trusted colleague, Sergeant Miller, they'll have to try a damn sight harder. By the summer of 1964, the investigation has slowed to a bureaucratic crawl. The city has moved on, its attention captured by new headlines. The mill is scheduled for demolition once again, this time with little fanfare or newspaper coverage. But Havers cannot let it go. The mystery has become an obsession, a splinter in his mind. One evening, long after everyone else has gone home, he sits alone at his desk, the green-shaded lamp pooling light on the pages of Samuel Day's journal. He reads it for what must be the 100th time, his eyes scanning the frantic technical script. And that's when he notices it, a series of faint, almost imperceptible indentations on one of the last pages, as though someone had written a message on a sheet of paper above it, pressing down hard, and then had torn that top sheet away. His heart hammering against his ribs, Havers takes a soft graphite pencil and gently, carefully, shades over the marks. Letters, then words, slowly bleed into existence from the ghostly impressions. The vat isn't for dye. It's for preservation. That single, chilling phrase reframes everything. If the vats weren't meant to dye, fabric, what, or who, were they meant to preserve? Havers requests one last, desperate search of the site the day before the wrecking ball is due to swing. Officially, it's for final evidence retrieval. Unofficially, he is hunting for something to explain that maddening sentence. The demolition crew, irritated by the delay, reluctantly grants him access for one afternoon. As he and Sergeant Miller move through the corpse of the building, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space, Havers' boot strikes a section of the concrete floor that sounds different, hollow. They kneel, clearing away debris, and find a poorly fitted section of floorboard. Prying it open with a crowbar, they reveal a narrow, brick-lined chamber beneath, half flooded with stagnant, oily water. And there, submerged in the murk, is a metal drum about the size of an oil barrel, stamped with a faded, but still recognizable, government seal. When they haul it up, the weight is immense. The stench that erupts as they crack the sealed lid drives them back, gagging. Inside is a liquid, viscous and amber-colored, like thick, congealed honey. And suspended within it, perfectly preserved, is a human form. A woman's face floats just below the surface, her features eerily intact. Her eyes are open, a pale, milky blue, her lips slightly parted as if caught mid-breath. The preservation is an impossibility. Her skin is pale and waxen, but shows no sign of decay. The coroner, later, would estimate she has been dead for over 20 years, but her body defies the very logic of time. The press never gets a whiff of this discovery. The report is filed, immediately sealed, and stamped confidential, not for public record. Havers, however, circumvents protocol and writes a separate note in his personal log, the one he keeps locked away. Subject does not match the 3 primary victims. Age approximately 40. Distinct facial mole on right cheek. Cross-reference all employee records for 1941. Possible supervisory staff? Who is she? She isn't on any list. Not Eleanor, not Nora, not Samuel. No woman matching that description is recorded as ever having worked at Whitworth Dye and Sons. And yet, there she is, a perfect, silent witness, preserved as if time itself had chosen to keep her secret, floating in her golden tomb. After that discovery, a fundamental shift occurs in Leonard Havers. The pragmatic detective recedes, replaced by a quieter, more withdrawn man, haunted by what he has seen. He continues to make inquiries, but they are half-hearted, and most are met with a wall of bureaucratic silence. Then, in December 1964, he simply disappears. His car is found abandoned in the long-stay car park of Piccadilly Station, his coat and hat neatly folded on the passenger seat. His official case file, his personal log, all his notes on the Whitworth Mill case, they are all gone. The official story, disseminated to the press and even to most of the force, is that Detective Inspector Havers took early retirement due to ill health and relocated to the coast for the sea air. But those who knew him, his colleagues, his worried wife, say this cannot be true. He'd spoken to his wife just the day before about a lead that could break the whole thing wide open. He had seemed not ill, but driven, possessed by a final, desperate energy. And then, in early 1965, a clerk in the Central Records Department finds something odd. A small, brown paper-wrapped parcel, misplaced in a delivery of routine stationery, is addressed in an unsteady, almost frantic hand to D.I. Havers, care of Whitworth Street Division. Inside is a single roll of undeveloped 35mm film. Driven by curiosity, the clerk has it developed. The photographs that emerge are grainy, dark. They show the interior of a small, dimly lit room with rough brick walls. A single wooden desk sits in the center, and on the desk, a single horrifying object, a glass specimen jar containing a preserved face floating in amber liquid, staring out through the glass with milky, sightless eyes. The final frame of the roll shows something else. Caught in the reflection of the glass jar is the silhouette of a man, his features blurred but his outline unmistakable. It is Leonard Havers. The negative sleeve was labeled simply Property Room 7, but the Manchester Police Force had no Property Room 7. It never had, and that, officially, is where the trail ends. A detective and his mystery, both swallowed by the same silent, implacable machine. Unofficially, rumors persist, whispered in pubs and among the men who worked the demolition. They claim that on certain foggy mornings, you could still hear the faint, ghostly hum of machinery coming from beneath the new concrete, long after the power lines had been cut. One laborer, a man not given to fancy, swore he saw a set of fresh, small footprints appear in the wet cement of the new foundation, leading for where the mill's office once stood toward the dark waters of the canal, stopping abruptly at the edge as if the walker had simply dissolved into the air. The official record calls the case inconclusive. The files remain sealed under national security provisions, a black hole in the city's archives. But the locals, the ones who still remember the day the bones came up from the soil like a bad harvest, they tell another version in hushed tones. They say there were more barrels down there, that the one Havers and Miller pulled from the sub-basement wasn't the first, just the first that anyone had found. They say the rest were buried deeper, under tons of new, fast-poured concrete, waiting for the city to forget all over again. And sometimes, they say, when the River Medlock floods its banks and the orange glow of the construction lights flickers against the evening fog, something pale and shapeless can be seen rising to the water's oil-slicked surface before slowly sinking back into the dark, carrying its secrets back down into the mud. This is where we leave it for now. 3 workers vanished into the noise of war in 1942. 3 skeletons unearthed by progress in 1964. 1 woman preserved as if the clock had simply stopped for her alone. And an inspector who tried to follow the truth into the dark and was, himself, extinguished. In part 2, we will pry open those sealed government files. We will uncover the terrible truth about Project Citrine that Henry Pollard was too frightened to tell. We will learn what truly happened to Detective Inspector Leonard Havers, and why what began in the dive vats of a Manchester mill was an experiment that was never, ever supposed to be found. Until then, ask yourself, how many stories does your own city keep buried beneath its streets, its foundations, its official history? And if someone started digging tomorrow, what nameless, terrible things might they find? This was Trace Crime Files. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and justice is never as simple as it seems.